Richard, it's Amelia. I don't know if you can hear me. Just give me a sign.
Yeah, no problem. Can you hear me?
Okay, thanks. I don't know if I can hear him, but that's probably because of the sound of the room. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to this policy dialogue on EU-UK relations. Thankfully not Brexit, but actually talking about EU-UK relations, which is part of our project presidency, and very happy to organize this together with PISM. It's a very good time to speak about EU-UK relations because it's a bad time, because we are facing a very real security threat in Europe. We are facing a situation which is highly volatile, highly difficult. So it is very important that liberal democratic Europe stands together, and that it is Europe and not the EU alone. So the role the UK and others play is very important in this. We have to stand together to support Ukraine, to deter future Russian aggression, but also in light of the destructive actions of the current US president. So there's a big agenda, very difficult and very meaningful actions which need to take place. Of course, there has been, I'm not sure whether we should call it a reset. Some people don't like the term, but certainly there has been a change in the EU-UK relationship. We have moved on from the rather bad relationship, which was there during the Brexit process. But now we have to ask, what is it we can actually practically do? What are the real areas where we can cooperate to address these major challenges? So very good to have this discussion today, and I'm looking forward to not only listening, but also participating, and I'll hand over to you.
Fabian, thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Professor Amelia Hadfield. I'm the founder and director of the Centre for Britain and Europe, which is based at the University of Surrey. That's in Guildford. That's about a half an hour train ride just south of London as well. It's fantastic to be able to be participating in what I think is an incredibly seminal opportunity. I've been asked to sort of set the framework as if it really needs setting, but I'll do so briefly, and then I'll tell you what the running order is. So obviously recent events have massively thrown UK-EU shared interests and our shared values, which is primarily what we're here to talk about today, into stark relief. And that primarily is because of two things. One, the push from Russia in terms of the invasion of Ukraine, and then the Trump, I'll just call it the upheaval, which has come in a series of waves. And even if we just focus down to the last couple of weeks with a sort of battering ram, if you like, of Hegseth advance, lots and lots of warning shots. And then I think what can only be described as a shakedown in the Oval Office, and then withdrawing military and then intelligence to Ukraine, and then restarting them again. And then a global tariff imposition, including what's clearly going to be a tit for tat with the European Union. So Trump has exerted enormous pressure on Ukraine. And he's shown a very soft touch with Putin and been largely supportive of Russia, possibly in order to maybe pull it away from China, but we'll see. From my perspective, I think the Minerals Treaty is a distraction. I think it's not materially important to have a real look at what actually sits in the ground in Ukraine. I think this is a pressure point to control Zelensky or possibly his successor. The US chill on US backing for European security guarantees in Ukraine is deeply unnerving. And I imagine we're going to be talking about that this morning. I think there's two scenarios. There's a worst case freezing scenario with no support whatsoever from key US sources on supporting a prospective EU peacekeeping force or a reassurance force, perhaps, or even a no-fly zone. The best case, perhaps, is a thawing scenario with limited US logistical, intelligence, surveillance, and recon support, but not the much-needed air defense and air cover. Meaning Europeans and NATO allies are going to have to do it alone. And in doing so, quite possibly face the wrath of Trump for merely going ahead with it. And they're going to have to do this in parallel with emerging projects like Rearm Europe, knowing that itself will likely set off further complications with Putin. So the EU response, of course, now in its third year, our 16th sanctions package, and a European summit recently, and the new project, Rearm, 5 pillars, which I think for the most part is quite a strong and clear step forward. But to my mind, still unclear is how much of those 5 pillars are actionable, how much of the pledged 800 billion euro is directly to support EU defense spending, and how much to support Ukraine. So what is the EU actually doing? Is it assisting Ukraine on its own merits? Is it making Ukraine a porcupine, as it were, spiky and indigestible? Is it beefing up defenses in EU frontline countries contiguous with Ukraine? Is it going a step further? Is it rearming all of Europe and effectively establishing Europe's own security guarantee? Is it being part of the negotiating ceasefire, whether on the inside or the outside, or is it all 4? NATO looks willing, but I think has become increasingly hamstrung and not particularly close to engaging even with the discussions. Germany, Merz actually have moved very swiftly from being fiscal hawkish on the one side to a sort of spend support approach. And that supports the UK's plan, I don't really like this term, but it's what's been bandied around, the bomb bank plan. The UK response, I think, recently has been clearer in terms of leadership by Starmer himself, gathering together a coalition of the willing, working very effectively, I think, with Macron, and announcing a new £1.6 billion loan for Ukraine to buy 500 advanced air defense missiles and the bomb bank plan that I mentioned. And that would see up to £20 billion in government funding, multiplied by up to 200 billion in private capital for military investment. I think to some extent this quite nicely aligns with the 5 pillars of the Commission's recent rearm plan. So the UK needs to be added to the mix, ladies and gentlemen. UK leadership needs to be added to the mix. Now's the time to work with the UK and to ensure that the EU and Ukraine are in the best possible position for what lies ahead, whether that's negotiations or ceasefire or post-ceasefire or reconstruction. And I think there is some very strong abilities for the UK, not just in terms of security and defense, but possibly financing as well, and underwriting financing by investment. From the previous discussions we had this morning, I'm going to just 1 or 2 quick takeaways before we hand over to the panel. One was repeated reference to the red lines, but one of the panelists suggests don't get too hung up on the red lines. Obviously, they're clear, they're important, but they still leave a huge amount of space. I don't think they're inherently constrictive, and that's for me, that's rather helpful. And also a read across to UK-EU trade relations, that perhaps we're coming into the period now of new, more muscular model, if you like, for the EU of trade arrangements, maybe a much larger, perhaps with greater carrying capacity, the possibility to include more sectors, if you like energy, or sanctions, or even investment, and more actors like Canada. And perhaps we're moving towards a sort of trusted trade partnership, which I think would be extremely helpful. From last night, Putin has issued a triple lock, if you like, on a prospective ceasefire. Any deal must include international recognition of seized territory, a commitment that Kyiv will never join NATO, pledges that European peacekeepers will not serve in the country to protect against another Russian attack. So what now? And what next? I'm delighted to welcome Fabian back to give some of his perspectives. And then Fabian will be followed by Przemysław Biskup, a senior research fellow at PISM, who is helping us to organize this event, by I was going to say old, but I'll say a very venerable friend and colleague, and that's Professor Richard Whitman, who is a professor of politics and international relations at the University of Kent and senior fellow in the UK and a Changing Europe. And then Kinga, who I've just met this morning, Redlowska, who's head of CFS Europe from RUSI. I'd ask everybody to try to stick, if you can, to 4 or 5 minutes, because I do want to have a little bit of interaction across the panel. And then, of course, we want to hear from you. We want questions and answers from the audience, many of whom are online as well. Maria's going to help me facilitate this. And then to close out, we'll have a few closing words, again, from PISM, from Melchior Shepanek. Right. So, Fabian, over to you. Thank you.
Work. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Thank you very much. So I'll try to keep it brief, but looking very much forward to also the discussion afterwards. But I think the real big question, which has been in the room for a while, ever since the new government in the UK has been elected, is how do we move from mood music to concrete achievements? The mood music clearly has improved quite substantially. The acrimony which was there with the previous government is not the case anymore. I think also the immediate fears and concerns associated with Brexit have somewhat been diffused, not least the question of Northern Ireland. So it has been a restart of the relationship. But the question is now, how do we actually fill that with something more concrete at a time when there's also a huge amount of movement on both sides, but certainly from an EU perspective, we are talking about defense and security, which is not a normal subject for the European Union. So that adds to the difficulty because it sometimes also creates frictions on the EU side. What of this is actually EU, what is member state, and how do you bring all of that together? I think there are certain, I'm not sure that in the current environment we can talk about low-hanging fruits because everything is difficult with the actions of the president. But there are certainly some areas where there is such a high degree of agreement between the EU, and when I'm talking about the EU, I mean liberal democratic EU. Unfortunately, we also have enemies within which we have to take into account, but I'm talking about those who are willing to continue to support Ukraine, who are willing to also work together on a common European defense. So there's a big overlap in for example, the commitment to continue to support Ukraine, to build up capacity in Europe, to deal with the partial or full withdrawal of American security from the continent. When it comes to other areas or some of the more concrete questions, then we're very quickly back into discussions around, well, how would that look like in particular when there are real interests at stake on both sides? I think when it comes to the trade and cooperation agreement, I would very much presuppose that there won't be very much change. We are not going to review the TCA. I don't think there's an appetite for that. Of course, the TCA has always been open to build on, so there are possibilities to extend it. There are some areas where it can be made easier, but I would say this is not the area where we should focus too much of our attention. I think there are some areas in the justice and home affairs field where we could do much more together. Also, in part, to have a real defensive stance for our democracies against foreign influence or against the enemy within, which is trying to destroy our democracies. So there, I think, could be a lot more cooperation and a lot more mutual learning, including also dealing with the finance side, which is a major issue. Energy has already been mentioned. I think there's, of course, a high degree of interest, including also countries like Norway. Clearly, these are corporations which could be very mutually beneficial. And there are some technical hurdles. I won't go into detail, but those could be overcome. But yes, the big item is defense and security. And there, I think it is the real question about are we moving in a direction of a real coalition of the willing? And that comes back to this question of the enemy within. Are we going to do something in parallel to the EU, which does also involve third countries like the UK? That's still a big question, but I think it is the direction which we are going in, which would have the benefit of really enabling full participation of the UK in many of these issues. I think the big prize in the background, which we haven't talked so much about, is capital markets. I think the EU would benefit very much from UK capital markets to finance the investments which are needed. At the same time, for UK capital markets, the world has become a more hostile place. So having more customers within Europe would also be beneficial. But this is an area which is incredibly difficult and where there are a lot of interest on both sides. My final thought would be to say that much of the negotiation of these issues, I believe, is not going to be done in public. It is going to be done behind the scenes, giving also plausible deniability to governments on all sides. And I think this is very much a role of think tanks, and EPC is in the process of restarting our track 1.5, track 2 between EU and UK, precisely because of that. But more details will follow on that shortly.
Thank you very much for the possibility to speak today. I wanted to start from general observation. Fabian said, so what I will say should be read as kind of supplementary comments and remarks to the general picture that has already been quite established in a very good way. I would start from the observation that can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. I would start from the general observation that it was an unfortunate fact that the whole area of foreign policy and defense and security cooperation has fallen out from the negotiations in 2020. But at the same time, it's a fact of life that the TCA omitted the whole chapter that was originally foreseen to to be within that treaty. And that means that in this quite decisive moment for the European security, we are in a position that actually there is this possibility of negotiating quite a new and deliberately separate deal on the security and defense between European Union and the UK on the top or next to the framework that has been created by the TCA. I'm mentioning this because from the point of view of Poland and other countries on the EU's and NATO's eastern flank, obviously defense and security is of utmost importance and of utmost urgency. And from that point of view, the UK is an indispensable partner if we are to address even the most basic issues within that field in a reasonable time framework, which is now being created to the great extent by forces from outside Europe, especially the administration of President Trump. And so from that point of view, it would be highly advisable to consider by the EU side to basically ring-fence the defense and security cooperation as a separate field with separate set of rules that would be considerably more flexible than those within the TCA, just to make sure that we can exploit our joint potential, both strictly military, but also technological and military industrial. This obviously corresponds with the priorities of the Polish presidency in the EU Council, which we have now, which stipulates seven different dimensions of European security, coming from strictly hard defense security through migration processes, through energy independence and so on. I think that within all those fields, there is a huge potential for cooperation with the UK, and hopefully this potential will be tapped into by the upcoming EU-UK defense agreement. I would also like to make an observation that in parallel to those EU-UK negotiations, we have a series of bilateral negotiations between EU countries and the UK. And in this context, it's worth mentioning that Poland is now in the process of negotiating a defense treaty with the UK. And once it's completed, and the deadline for this is December, it will be a second defense treaty within a decade. The previous one has been finalized in 2017 and entered into force in 2018. And on the top of that, we have a series of agreements that are being were already signed or are being negotiated with Ukraine between a group of countries that contains the UK. So it's a fact of life that we have an emerging group of highly dedicated countries to support of Ukraine, but also strengthening European security that stretch from along the eastern flank of the EU for obvious reasons, but also bends towards the west through the Nordics and up to the UK. And obviously, at the end of the day, we have to cooperate and treat this space as a singular space. So thank you. That will be all from me for the moment.
Very much indeed, Przemysław. Richard, we're going to come to you next. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. My apologies for not being with you. I was inside the Brussels Beltway until yesterday, but I had to return home for another event here. So this is an incredibly timely discussion. I mean, not least, of course, because minds are now focusing on the the Leaders Summit on the 19th of May. And it's going to be a sort of busy agenda for the UK in terms of foreign policy activity, because it has that summit, there's the Franco-British summit, and then of course all eyes will turn to the NATO Hague summit, which could, depending on your levels of anxiety, either turn out to be a train wreck or something much less than less complicated, something like the London summit that we had under the first Trump presidency. But I think it's useful to think about what we might realistically get from that summit, and to pick up on Fabian's point, to think about this really, I think, as a staging post rather than something that's going to be closed off or even set a really clear agenda for the next few years. And with a colleague at RUSI, Ed Arnold, we suggested last summer that actually the really important thing to work towards is a really embracing declaration that focuses much more on areas for cooperation than institutional landmarks or achievements. And I think a key part of that has to be to shift the dial of the language that we use. We need to start talking about one another as in an alliance. We need to start using the language of alliance, and we need to start thinking in terms of ways in which we can solidify what is already a very close working relationship when it comes to foreign policy. And I think what's remarkable, if you think back from where we were, and obviously Russia's actions in Ukraine have been a huge catalyst for this, that we are now in what I would characterize as a period of détente in EU-UK relations, that the mood has changed, the possibilities in terms of what we can talk about have altered, but the substantive areas of difference are still there, but how we handle them, I think, is much more mature and much more agreeable. But what we've ended up with, I think, on the foreign policy side is something that works, what I'd call an organized ad hoc relationship. I mean, there's an increased tempo of interaction. You know, there are all sorts of contacts that we could go into. But I think the landscape for those interactions is now far more complicated. Obviously, the transatlantic aspect, and really the key challenge that the UK, the EU and EU member states share is how we're going to manage this relationship going forward. I mean, the essential change for us in the European security order is that we are now in a position in which the US role in Europe is indeterminate. How much is going to be evolved, for how long it's going to be involved, and what degree it wants to dial up or dial down its commitments. And that's going to be a key ordering challenge. And if you just look at what the UK has done over the last few weeks, it's essentially adopted a balancing strategy with the US on the one hand, you know, trying to tuck itself into a useful role as part of a peace process, which was not the peace process of Europeans choosing, but on the other hand, to try and balance that with the relationship with Ukraine, you know, not just recommitting to Ukraine's security, but also backing that up with resources. And, you know, walking that tightrope is a tightrope that many other European states are engaged in at the moment. And that's not going to get any easier, I would suggest. So what might we reasonably seek to achieve as partners beyond you know, the nice words and the desire to do more together? Well, on the foreign policy side, as I say, things are in the right place. And I think what we need to work out a little bit harder is to try and think about how we systematize, particularly in the areas that have already been touched on in energy. In particular, we are now incredibly energy interdependent with the United States. You know, we have this relationship where we've swapped our dependence on Russian gas for dependence on US gas. And you know, those who are anxious about having a reliance on a supplier like the US, and we need to be anxious, I think, relying on one supplier to the degree to which we do on LNG, we need to factor that into an administration where we can't always guarantee how to respond. On security and defense, I mean, it's clear if we look back to the political declaration, there are an easy set of wins, I think, but they're not very ambitious. I think the kind of third country agreements that exist between the EU and third countries are easy to do, but don't really add anything significant. I think particularly with the order of the challenge we've got in terms of how we deal with an evolving European security architecture. And clearly the most difficult area, but the one we really need to make work, is on the capabilities development side, and particularly the related defense industrial strategy. So I'm going to throw out a wild and wacky suggestion, if I may, a wrapper, if you like, that we might want to try and organize some of these discussions in. And why don't we think in terms of a common market for defense? You know, all these discussions that we're having about capital and how we raise capital, how we spend capital efficiently, we need to look at how we move people around Europe who are involved in the defense industry business, how we move information backwards and forwards, as well as the goods themselves. Brits are very happy with the idea of a relationship with Europe being part of a common market historically, so that wouldn't be too difficult. But more seriously, I think we might need to think about an organizing idea, because otherwise there's a danger that we're going to end up with organized eclecticism, I think, where we don't necessarily pull in the most effective and efficient directions. Last but by no means least, as far as I know, the venue for the summit meeting in London hasn't been announced. We've had, you know, a gathering in Windsor where there's a nice castle. We had a nice gathering at Blenheim where we have a palace. My suggestion now is that maybe we should think about one of the things that is a real landmark for the UK, which is to have it in a football stadium. I would suggest Arsenal, because it sends out the message that we're serious about defence if we host it in an Arsenal. And at the same time, of course, that is a club which is very familiar in moving around Europe. So there you go, a couple of suggestions to provoke or possibly to entertain.
Thank you, Richard, for your combination of football-induced organized eclecticism via venue shopping. That's brilliant. Kinga, let's come to you finally. Thank you.
Thank you. I represent Center for Finance and Security at RUSI, which was established 10 years ago. And it's no coincidence that it was set up in the RUSI UK's leading and world's oldest defense and security think tank. Because back then, 10 years ago, our director recognized something not that many people appreciated fully at that time, that finance has become an increasingly important dimension of global security. And recent increased global tensions and power shifts clearly expose Europe to strategic weaknesses in the area of economic security. And that's something I would like to talk about today and offer some thoughts on this, because evidently the UK and the US must coordinate to strengthen response to threats and address shared risks in this area. And we at the Center for Finance and Security at RUSI, we established last year a task force that convenes a cohort of experts from the UK and the EU, both from the public and the private sector, to discuss this. We so far, it's an excellent platform to brainstorm and compare notes, especially between the two sectors. And we published 2 excellent workshop reports that in a very concise manner pass main takeaways from those brainstorming sessions. And the main takeaways are that we all know basically what the risks are in terms of economic security, or what sort of risks and weaknesses that apply both to the EU and the UK. And these are, of course, cyber security, the dependence on external supply chains, and also economic and technological espionage. Finally, I think very importantly, the risk lies in a fragmented policy response across the EU and EU member states, but also across the EU and the UK. And of course, collaboration on this topic between a tighter collaboration between the member states, but also EU and the UK can align regulations, improve data sharing, and create a united response. And this unified approach across the channel helps to stabilize Europe's position and mitigate the threats. And so how this can look in practice. So in practice, in the sphere of economic security, as well more broadly in the defense sector, the key thing is to support public-private partnership across the EU and the UK. Equally important, the policy-making process. We need to develop European economic security strategy that will include the UK. We need to invest in cybersecurity and especially critical infrastructure. And an excellent example where this cooperation between the UK and the EU is already very visible is the activities and mainly UK leadership under Joint Expeditionary Force, JEF, to secure the to tackle and counter Russian shadow fleet in the Baltic Sea. This is an excellent example of such an enhanced cooperation that is working really well in this area. We need to diversify supply chains and invest in domestic alternatives, both in the EU and the UK, and foster resilient innovation system by protecting intellectual property, but also protecting the EU and the UK against espionage. And finally, we need to, when we think about economic security and how cooperation, the cross-channel cooperation can support that aim, we need to think about economic security in terms of offense, not only defense. And so when we look at the toolkit, the economic statecraft toolkit, obviously we need to talk about sanctions. And actually, if we are looking for an area where UK-US cooperation in the recent years has been excellent, are G7 sanctions, the imposition, the implementation and enforcement of G7 sanctions on Russia. This cooperation is might be even more important in light of potential shift in US administration and sort of disalignment of G7 countries on sanctions on Russia. And that's something we definitely need to take a closer look at.
Thank you very much, Kinga. That's fantastic. And thank you for delving into the economic finance investment component, which is so vital, I think, to all of the other approaches we've talked about. I can't believe how quickly the time has gone. We've got really only 15 minutes left. So although I wanted a little bit of sort of inter-panel dynamism, I think hopefully we've listened to each other and we've got a lot of really, really good takeaways. So I would like to, I think, to throw it over to the Q&A. Just a reminder to those of us who are joining online, please use the Q&A part of the chat, and then Maria can pick those up. What I'll do is I'll take a group of questions, if I may. I'll start with 2 from the audience and then 1 online if I can, and then we'll see if we can flip that going forward. We've got a roving mic, so please put your hand up, wait till the mic comes. And can I just ask, in the interests of brevity, questions, not comments? Thank you very much. This gentleman here, thank you.
Yes, hi, I'm Pelle Gertsen, I'm your friendly Danish lefty. Just in the light of all of this, I will refrain from making my comment that the emperor has no clothes. I just want to ask your thoughts that coming from a country where we've always looked to Washington and London for security ever since the end of the Second World War, I now find myself coming from a country that Trump has not ruled out invading militarily. And when we discuss security now, it is not Washington nor even London we look to, it is Paris and Warsaw. And when we discuss a possible replacement for the US nuclear umbrella, it is not the British one that is being mentioned, but the French one. So in light of this, how relevant is it to discuss UK as part of an integral security structure in Europe? And what do you think the UK would have to do to gain back its credibility? Because I think it might have been lost somewhere.
Thank you very much. That's a grab bag of questions that the panel can choose from. Thank you very much. Let's have another hand up for other questions in the room. Gentlemen here, thank you.
Hello, my name is Eli Byrne from the Irish Business and Employers Confederation. We spoke about the enemy within. I'm just wondering, we talked also about bilateral agreements, agreements in parallel to the European Union as well. Is there another way of doing this, circumventing all these different avenues of agreements, or what is the most efficient way of tackling that issue of the enemies within, as you put it? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kinga, possibly one for you, that one. Maria, could we take an online question, please? If you could just pass her. Thank you.
So there's a question on EU-UK Security Pact, and Antoine Perry is saying, how feasible is EU-UK Security Pact under the current circumstances, and within what time frame could it be realistic to be achieved? Alternatively, could a different approach be more viable? Thank you.
EU-UK Security Pact. Thanks very much. Well, I think just for this one, we'll go in order of the speakers themselves. So, Fabian, you can choose one or two or all of them. Entirely depends how ambitious you are. Over to you. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks very much. I mean, firstly, this question about Paris or London, I don't think we have a choice. We unfortunately have neglected our defense for decades. And we have been exceptionally dependent on the US. So the reality is that we have to do an enormous amount, and it will take time. So the idea that if we have an actor like the UK, which is on our side in this, that we would exclude that in some way is just not feasible for me. So this is about bringing all the liberal democracies who want to defend our way of life, our prosperity, our security, our democracy together. There's just no choice than having everyone. The nuclear umbrella, I think, is a major question which we are going to have to tackle. But I don't think it is a question of saying we now replace the American nuclear umbrella with the French one. It's a completely different scale, a different discussion. So we need to think much broader about our security. And I think this is also whether we call it an EU-UK Security Pact or whatever format we choose. I think what matters is the substance. It's not in what way we are actually phrasing this. It is about making concrete commitments, common commitments. I would say the task we have in front of us now, between, again, all liberal democracies who want to work together on this, and actually I wouldn't exclude also on some of these issues countries outside Europe, because when we are talking, for example, about economic security, they are global actors which should be on our side there as well, including Japan, for example, Australia, etc. Canada clearly also being in the firing line. So I think this is about how do we address the common risks which we are now facing together. That's effectively what we need to talk about, and in whatever form. And that brings me to the question of the method of doing that. What is most effective? I wouldn't even talk about most effective anymore. I would talk about what is possible. And what we have seen is that there are certain avenues within the European Union which are not possible because we have a setup where the enemy within, and I'm using that term very deliberately because I think we have to be more direct about what we are facing here, where the enemy within can block. And we cannot afford that common action is blocked. So if it is not possible within that framework, we have to do it outside that framework. Now, in the EPC, we've made a suggestion last summer about supra-governmental avant-gardes, which is a particular version of coalitions of the willing, where we could go further, where we could try to preserve as much of the common features in that kind of cooperation as we can. But the general approach has to be that we start with what do we have to do? And then we talk about how we can deliver that. And if one method doesn't work, we need to choose another method.
Thank you very much. Przemysław, thank you.
Thank you. I would very much agree with what was said about what Fabian said about London versus Paris versus Warsaw. I think it's basically a fact of life that we have to pull our resources together if we are to achieve something like decent levels of security in a few years. I would also, on this occasion, mention one thing where London actually seems to be leading at the moment. You mentioned that you're a Danish lefty. Well, in Britain, there is undeniably left-wing government, and that left-wing government is in a process of slaughtering holy cows of the left, cutting foreign aid budget to boost up defense spending. Yesterday, we had a big decision about canceling a huge part of the bureaucracy running the National Health Service. I think this shows very high levels of determination, seriousness, and this should inspire us all in Europe in facing very difficult trade-offs that will have to be made to make our joint security happening. And my other comment concerning enemies within would be a variation of on your question, and would actually be partly about your country. I wouldn't use in this context maybe the term enemy, but I would like to point out that actually as the EU, we are not a single bloc. We have a number of countries that are non-aligned, that basically refuse to take up responsibility for our joint security. In the white paper that is now circulating about European defense, there is interesting statistic invoked that the average spending on defense and security in the EU at the moment is 1.5% of the GDP. Ireland's, for example, is 0.25. And we can't really have that if we are serious about our common security. We have every country to pull their own weight and be serious about that. And not, basically hiding behind others, yeah? So that's also a challenge that has to be addressed, not only on the EU level, but also, I would say, responsibly on respective national levels. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Richard, can we come to you, please? Thank you. Richard, are you able to respond?
Sorry, the sound disappeared at your end for me.
Over to you for a couple of responses to the Q&A. Thank you.
A couple of comments, if I may, if you can hear me okay. On the security pact comment, I mean, I think we have to think about this as a multi-strand project that.
Richard, I'm really sorry. We've lost the sound at your end. Hang on, see if we can. I think he might have lost us as well. I'll tell you actually, hang on. He's back. He's back.
Yeah,
Richard, sorry. Do you want to just pick up those last couple of phrases? Thank you.
No worries. Obviously, the Chinese are listening in and taking part of our band. No, I'm just making the point about the security pact that it is as an idea, and I think it's a fantastically organizing idea, but it's really complicated to implement in all of its aspects. So I think what we need to do is to set up the ambition and then crack on with the things that we can do quickly and easily, and lots of those are connected to foreign policy, security dialogue, and aspects of the defense relationship. I'm a bit puzzled by the first intervention talking about the UK and the UK's integrity. I mean, I'm sure there are people in the room that can, from HMG, you can talk to that. But I mean, I think the evidence is a bit contradictory in the sense, in terms of the UK standing, in that just the plethora of bilateral and unilateral agreements that we have in place now, and certainly been put in place since 2016, suggests that that view may not hold across the continent. And I think one of our challenges really is to how we take that sort of tapestry of relationships and turn it into something which is mutually reinforcing. And we haven't got an obvious place in which we do that. Although I've got an idea piece coming out for RUSI fairly shortly, which is on the European Security Council, which is of course a long-standing idea, but I think worth coming back to think about whether we need some place where we have some high-level discussions about European security, because we're getting that by default with groupings such as the E5 and so on, whether we want to regularize some of that. So I'll leave it there, if I may.
Richard, thank you very much, and apologies for the IT hiccup. Kinga, finally to you. Thanks.
Thank you. So maybe to the question about the unity, I think in recent years, in the last 3 years, there was no better area where we could observe how the unity restricts or imposes restrictions on the EU than sanctions on Russia. That's something that we need to look into, the necessity to take some decisions unilaterally. We need to look into it in the long term and short term. That's something that should be fixed. It's not an easy fix. So indeed, we should initiate debate on how to address this challenge in a long run, but I guess this is a debate for years. In a short run, we should be more creative. And so, for example, when it comes to economic security, interestingly, there are tools that the EU can deploy that require only a qualified majority to roll out. For example, tariffs. So that's something we should look into in a short term, how to be smart, how to beat the opposing forces that are effectively blocking developments and supporting the resilience and the sort of response the EU should be offering. And we're gonna see very soon how this is gonna be displayed, but in a long run, we cannot afford a situation where we are facing countries such as Hungary threatening not to sustain the sort of sanctions every 6 months, including a very, very sensitive issue, especially now in light of peace negotiations, which is the fact of freezing Russian central bank state assets.
Thank you very much. Reluctantly, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very aware that I and Melchior are standing between you and lunch, and that's a very precarious position to be in. So I'm afraid we can't take any more Q&A, but you can publicly come up and nobble any one of the panelists with other Q&A. Melchior, let me turn over to you for final conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I won't take long. After today's discussion, I'm quite positive that we have a window of opportunity for improved relations between the UK and the EU. I was glad to hear quite a number of positive examples and to hear about several actions from both sides that happened recently and that clearly show that there is room for better relations, and clearly show this that there is common interest and common values that bind both sides. I believe now what is needed is determination, imagination, courage to first look for solutions and then implement them. So let me also take this opportunity to thank the European Policy Center for the invitation to join this project presidency. It's a great honor for us to be cooperating with the European Policy Center, and I would also like to thank Maria in particular for cooperation on this seminar. And let me also thank the panelists and the moderator for a very interesting and absorbing debate. So the only thing I can do now is to invite you to join me in a round of applause.
Can I thank our moderator for pronouncing so many Polish names and surnames so fluently at the beginning, like bravo.
We get one of the speakers.